live. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first interview of the second day of the Grand Multiliteracy event. And when we talk about multilingual literacy, there is reading, but also writing. And I got a lot of questions about motivating multilingual children to write in their home language, but also what to do concretely to teach the children to write, how to do that effectively and efficiently. So I'm very honored to welcome Dr. Annie Chang Ng to talk about the science of writing. So welcome, Annie, and thank you very much for accepting my invitation to the Grand Multiliteracy event.
Thank you so much, Yoshito. I watched all of your videos from last year with all of the researchers and practitioners, and I thought to myself, it's an honor for me to be able to jump on this year and share what I know and together collaborate with everyone. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a real honor for us as well. And so just to present you a bit, introduce you a bit. So you are pre-K to 12 reading specialists with expertise in biliteracy and multilingual learners. You have taught for 13 years across public, charter, and international schools, including Spanish and Mandarin dual immersion schools. In the past, you have coached teachers in social emotional learning with HighScope Educational Research Foundation and facilitated school and district-wide teacher training on writing instructions. Your previous research focused on professional learning, curricular implementation, and school leadership. You're in a trilingual household, so with Mandarin, Taiwanese, and English, and you received a BA in Latin American Studies and Spanish from Wellesley College, Master's in Education in Literacy and Language from Harvard Graduate School of Education, a doctorate in education in K-12 education leadership and policy from Vanderbilt University's Peabody College. And so you're passionate about integration of research, policy, and practice. So there is a lot you'll be able to talk about. It's a live, so all of you who are watching us, feel free to ask your questions or ask more details about some points to Dr. Chang Ng. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Yoshito. Looking forward to our chat today.
Me too. So to start, can you please tell us about the languages you're familiar with? Because we're going to talk about different writing systems and because there might be differences. So what are the languages you know?
So throughout my life, I've interacted with various languages, and there are 6 in total, but I would say I probably only am very confident in one, which is English.
Okay.
So I grew up outside Washington, D.C. in a Taiwanese American home where we spoke Mandarin and English, but my parents would speak to each other in Taiwanese. So, like many Taiwanese American children growing up, I also have a passive understanding of Taiwanese where we can understand, but I cannot speak it.
Okay.
And then I also speak Spanish because where I was growing up, there were a lot of opportunities for Spanish immersion. And I fell in love with the language and the cultures as a young child that in college I decided to major in it in Latin American studies and Spanish. And I would say for about 2 decades of my life, from 11 years old until, my 30s, that was a big part of my identity because I felt I could express myself in Spanish in a way that maybe I couldn't do so in Mandarin Chinese. Uh, and then the other 2 languages I learned when I was much older. So French when I was 16 in high school, and then Japanese, it wasn't until I was 30. I went to a summer immersion in Vermont to learn a
Okay.
little bit more about it.
Okay. Thank you. So quite a few languages. And so on Instagram, your name is Science of Writing.
Mhm.
So obviously writing is a big part of what you do, and so from your research, but also what you share with people. What got you interested in writing especially?
Mm. So there is a quote I want to share. I will
Yeah,
share my screen right now.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I feel that this quote captures why I became interested in writing. And it's from the National Commission on Writing, and it says, writing today is not a frill for the few, but an essential skill for the many. So for me, writing is something that children from all around the world of all different backgrounds should have access to in the heritage language, in the societal language. And I feel that it's a way to empower children to express themselves and as they grow into adults to perhaps contribute to changing the world into a better place. And so that might sound quite idealistic, but it's been very fun over the past decade plus as an educator to see that children do take to writing, although in many ways it's quite a complex skill.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Uh, and oh, sorry.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I wanted to start with comparing different techniques that are to do with the different languages that a child might be speaking. Because, for example, I grew up with French and Japanese,
Mm,
but I found that one thing that was very different between the two ways I was taught to write was that my Japanese teachers were telling me, so you need to write the characters in this order, so stroke orders. And in the French class as well, I learned, so A, you start like this, then you
mm,
do this. But in Japanese, like it stayed like my teachers would tell me from time to time if I was writing on the board, be careful, you need to write this first, etc.
mm,
But in French, like people write in whatever order they want. So even if there is something that's prescribed at the beginning,
mm.
it's ignored later on. And I was wondering if it was actually important or useful to learn a stroke order in certain languages more than others, or if there was one answer for all the languages, all the scripts.
That's a really great question, Yoshito. What you're describing is how the way each language works affects how it's taught. And so, whereas in one language, it might be very visual, like Japanese and Chinese, so stroke order is highly emphasized. In another language, it's also visual, but then there's the phonological, phonemic awareness aspect, the sound aspect that's quite important. So maybe it's emphasized in the beginning, but not as much as in like a visual logographic script. And I wanted to share a little bit more about stroke order. I would say, although the emphasis is different across languages,
Yeah,
as a whole, it is very useful for teaching handwriting and writing. And I'm going to explain why.
yeah.
Okay, just gonna. Okay,
Thank you for preparing
so
these
for
slides, by the way.
Yes, I felt that because writing is complex, I needed to share with you and the audience what it looks like. It might be easier to understand.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
so in terms of stroke order, one reason why it's important is for legibility. And so when we talk about some Asian scripts like Japanese, as you mentioned, and Chinese, right, there is an emphasis on stroke order for various reasons. One, it's balance and symmetry. So the way that you write the order of the strokes can actually help you create a more proportional character. And that can help other people read your handwriting better.
okay,
And this is an example of a character in kanji Japanese or Chinese, and
yeah,
it is often used as an example of the 8 basic strokes in Chinese. And as you can see from left to right, this is the stroke order that children would be taught to write in. And by the end, it creates a balanced shape, top to bottom, left to right. But if I were to draw it, it may not look as proportional. And so children learn this for symmetry, as you had mentioned earlier. Now,
okay,
the second reason stroke order is helpful, this goes for non-alphabetic languages as well as alphabetic languages like English. And this promotes automaticity in handwriting. And what I mean by this is stroke order with the alphabet can help children write with the fewest amount of hand movements. And so, one, this helps children conserve energy because it takes physical energy to write. But two, it helps children build muscle memory as they repeatedly write the same stroke order over and over again for each letter. So it's a very efficient way for young children to learn not to draw letters, but to write them and learn how to encode language through them. So this is a way that we can teach children that handwriting is a tool. So here's an example of the letter P. This one is tricky for young children because you have to break the line. You have to cut through the line. And sometimes children don't, it's not very natural as say the letter L or the letter I, which is, a vertical line. This one, you cut through the line. And then in some handwriting books, like Handwriting Without Tears, they'll use child-friendly language like dive down, swim up and over, around, bump. And then each time they practice, they do the same stroke order over and over again.
Yeah, I remember my sons when they were learning the letters, they were saying that kind of sentence like you have dive down, swim up the it's
Mm,
I guess it helps to have a phrase as well to remember how to write.
mm. Yes, it does. It does really quite help. And uh, one thing I wanted to add, if I may, is about
Yeah,
why is it important to be able to write efficiently? And so let me just share again.
yeah.
Here. Okay. So I wanted to share that for writers, there are three cognitive processes at play, both for young children and adults. They are planning what to say, then actually writing it down. Some people call that translation or translating. And then the other one is reviewing. So going back to what you've written and making sure that the ideas are clear and creative and what you meant. And so when young children are going through this writing process, they expend a ton of energy on something called transcription. And transcription includes both spelling and handwriting. So for you and I as adults, we've become fluent in handwriting and spelling over, years of practice. But for young children starting out, this is something new for them. And this is another reason stroke order is helpful because it helps build that automaticity in handwriting. Now, why is that important? Well, researchers name three basic building blocks of writing development: handwriting, spelling, and sentence construction. And when we develop fluency in handwriting and focus on stroke order, as you mentioned, this really helps facilitates children's ease with putting their ideas on paper. And as some researchers have pointed out, all three basic building blocks, they are skills that young children must draw upon in order to put their thoughts and ideas into writing. So without fluent handwriting or a device that can help translate your spoken language into written language, it's very hard for children to then have the working memory to focus on making sure that their story is told the way that they want.
Okay.
Mhm.
Ah, okay. And so now maybe a question I was wondering as well is, for example, in France, we learn to write in cursive, but
Mhm.
in England, it's all like, I don't know how it's called, but it's all the letters are detached. Um, and so when my sons were little, I wasn't sure if I had to, if I had to teach them how to write in cursive, or if I had to stay with the English way of writing. I opted for staying with the English way of writing in the end.
Mhm.
So, but is there, i- so when we have at home two languages that use the same script, but for example, in one language it's more cursive and the other one is in block letters, do we need to stick to one way of writing, or can we introduce two ways of writing? For example, the letter P would be like this or like this.
That's a very good question. Like, what is most effective for children as they're learning different languages? And I would say it depends on the child, and it also depends on your goal. So what I mean by that is, some children, they might have difficulty with handwriting, and so they might work with an occupational therapist to work on their fine motor skills in order
Yeah.
to be able to write with greater legibility. Now, some occupational therapists would recommend that children start with print and that they start with capital letters because capital letters, when you write them, they have easier strokes. Whereas
Okay.
lowercase letters, you often have to maybe go down and then up again on the same line, like say the letter M. And so
Yeah.
that makes it a little trickier. Plus, lowercase letters have curves, which can be tricky for young children, whereas capital letters are easier because they're bigger and then the strokes tend to be straight lines. Uh,
Okay.
but if your child is not working on fine motor skills and handwriting and doesn't work with an occupational therapist, then you might encounter an early literacy teacher like a pre-K, transitional K, or kindergarten teacher who actually would recommend starting with lowercase letters first. And the reason is because when young children are reading, the early reader books that they use predominantly have lowercase letters.
Yeah.
And so the thinking of literacy teachers is we want to teach children lowercase letters first in some cases, because those are more common than uppercase letters, which tend to appear only at the beginning of sentences or for, names of people, places, things, etc. And then your question about cursive is a really good one. So there has been debate on whether or not American schools should bring back cursive. And the benefit of cursive is that because the strokes are connected, children conceivably can jot down their ideas more quickly. And so if you have a tool like cursive handwriting, as a child, and if you learn it, you can translate your ideas and thinking onto the paper more quickly. And so this helps with idea generation. But if a child is already struggling with print, it may not be wise to introduce cursive because it is more difficult to make all those connections. And then the final thing I will add to answer your question is, although some people say, okay, start with capital letters because they're easier, or start with lowercase letters because they're more common, some
Yeah.
people actually say introduce both. Introduce capital A and capital A together. And in
Mm.
this one literacy expert's experience, he hasn't found that children get confused when both upper and lowercase letters are introduced. But
Okay.
again, it really depends on your child, their strengths and needs,
Yeah.
and then your goal as a parent, as a teacher. So if you want your child to write more quickly, maybe at some point in the future, cursive would be a great tool for their tool belt as a writer.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. So for just to come back on my sons, I
Mm.
remember that when we bought some books that were for young children, there was some cursive. And then at the beginning it was a bit difficult, but then really quickly they managed to make how to say, to match the letters to understand that this
Mm.
was P, for example, etc.
Mhm.
And so it's just by reading a few stories, and then they were able to read them on their own. So I guess once they're familiar with one, it doesn't take too much effort or too much time to get familiar with the other one.
That's an excellent point where your asset in one language or one script can transfer and help you develop a new
Right.
script or a new way of writing because
Okay.
it's teaching children how to see systems. So if they understand that the printed system connects sounds and words, then they can see, oh, it's the same transfer, but although the cursive looks a little different, it has the same function of connecting
Yeah.
sounds and letters together. Yeah, that's very good.
Ah, okay. Thank you. And I'd like to go a bit more with concrete ideas. So if some parents who are watching us want to start teaching their children to write, is there any kind of activities you would suggest when it's right at the beginning and just to get familiar with letters, I guess, or yeah, just the first
Absolutely.
steps.
I'm going to share my screen again because,
Yeah,
by the way, these slides I will post, I will send to Yoshito and I will post on my website because there are some I'll likely skip through because we may not have time.
yeah,
Um,
okay,
Okay, so for pre-writing or early writing, parents and teachers of very young children can use different materials to familiarize students with letter identification. And what I mean by letter identification is knowing letter names, but also the letter sounds. So matching the letter A with the sound A, and later on when they're older with the long vowel sound A. And then when we're very young, we can use sand to draw out the letters. We can even use letter stamps right over here and stamp them in Play-Doh. For very young kids, you want bigger letters, so you might just use Play-Doh by itself and create big, big letters. And then some educators and parents will also use chalk or paint or even bath crayons, which I didn't have when I was young, but these are crayons you can use in the bathroom. And as your child is, having a bath, they can draw on the tiles there and it comes off quite easily. So
okay,
any way to get the child exposure and fun in connection with letters, letter names, letter sounds, those are really great ways to create an opening for your child into the world of literacy, in this case, specifically writing. And then the last one is dot markers. So many of the viewers probably know that early writers, they might have like a really big piece of paper with one letter, and then they'll take the dot markers and trace the outline of the letter with dots. So again, as we were talking about earlier, younger children like bigger letters. So dot markers help with those bigger letters. And then as they grow in their understanding of writing the alphabet, they can change their tool so that eventually, it's crayon, pencil,
Yeah.
etc.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Very welcome.
And so just to come back on these activities, I've noticed some of them that are available in this book, the Toolbox for Multilingual Families. And so just to remind everyone that this book is free download on Amazon at the moment. So just during this event so until Sunday. So if you want to find some of these activities, you can check these. And so another thing I wanted to ask you because I really wondered when I was teaching my son. So my sons learned first to write in English and then French and Korean. But I remembered, so when I taught them French and Korean, I was trying to start with letters and characters or words that meant something for them. So our names, animals that they liked, etc. But in the school, so I know you don't need to start with A, B, C, D, etc. But I felt at the time that they were starting with random letters,
Hmm.
like I think M was one of the first ones they 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 started to learn. But I was wondering, is there a reason to choose some letters first and then leave others after?
Yes, very great question. So, what seems like a random order actually has a reasoning behind it. And I'll
Yeah.
explain the general principle, but I also want to share that there is no one right order. You'll see different curricula, different teachers, different schools using their own unique order, but there's always a reasoning behind it. So let me
Okay.
share with you right now.
Oh, thank you.
Mhm. Okay, so when we're talking about handwriting, some programs and educators will group letters based on the way they look. So in this example, which came out of a 5-year study, letters with similar strokes were grouped closer together. For example, straight lines like in the letter L and T, they're similar, so they're grouped and taught together for
Yeah,
efficiency. But letters that are easily confused, as we know, letters B and D, in this example, they are grouped further apart. So we have B here, and then D here. They're not taught together because they could conceivably cause confusion in young writers.
I see.
So for handwriting, the order is based on the way it looks. But when we talk about reading, some educators and programs will group letters based on frequency, how often they appear in text. So it's like what we were talking about earlier, the idea that some educators teach lowercase letters first because they're more common in young children's early readers. It's the same thing when we're teaching letter identification, letter names, letter sounds. Potentially, some people are motivated by teaching letters in groups that are more common. So your son, I think he mentioned like letters M and B and P and A were first, because combined together, those could easily make a word like P-A-M, Pam, right? And so the idea is that we don't need to wait to teach all 26 letters of the alphabet before children can decode and encode. We can actually give them frequent letters so that they can, right from the get-go, begin to decode, read, or encode, write on their own.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you very much. And then, oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. So what can we do to help children improve their spelling accuracy? So I guess when they get a bit older, so spelling will also some letters, like you said, they were very similar, so they might write one instead of the other. And even I guess children who are not dyslexic, they confuse letters.
Correct. Actually, there's this one study that highlighted certain letters are very easily confused among many children, like Q, J, Z, U, N. And there's different reasons for why they're confused, but it's very interesting that child after child, sometimes the same errors occurred with the very same letters. So with those, it would be very important to explicitly teach letter formation so that children have explicit structured instruction on how the letters are formed. Now, to answer your question about spelling accuracy, I would say my answer has two parts. So one, when we talk about spelling, we're talking still about handwriting, how to shape the letters. But the other thing we're talking about is how to combine letters together. So spelling phonics. So I will share with you what we do in schools and what we can also do at home. So research shows that there are certain ways of teaching handwriting that are quite effective for helping children retain and use them. The first is visual cues. So if you have letters that have arrows and numbers that help children understand the order and direction of each stroke, such that they're writing the letter in the same way each time and building muscle memory of it, that is very helpful. So if parents, if you're looking for a handwriting book and you see one with arrows and numbers, that's a good sign that this is going to guide your child to not draw out their letters randomly and haphazardly, but rather to write their letters in a systemic way that alleviates their working memory such that they can devote their attention not to shaping letters, but to using the letters to shape their ideas. And then there are two more methods for handwriting that research has come across time and time again. The other one has to do with memory. So there is a handwriting free program out of Iowa Reading Research Center, and they capitalize on the benefits of having children test out their memory with handwriting. So what you do is you cover the model letter, and then you copy the model letter without looking. So on this paper, for example, you can fold the paper in half. And as a child, you write it down without looking. And then at the end, you can open up the paper and then compare the model with what you wrote and see if there are any differences. And if there are, your teacher, your parent, and yourself, you can reflect on that and then make the changes accordingly. So studies have shown it's not just visual cues, but also testing out your memory that helps children solidify their automaticity with handwriting. And then the last one we've touched on a little bit, it's explicit instruction. So the idea that handwriting is not something that we learn naturally as we do speaking and listening for typically developing children, but it's something that should be taught. And so when we teach explicitly, what that looks like is as a parent or teacher, you model how the letter is formed, then you guide the child through it. So you're next to the child and helping the child repeat the same stroke order that you've done. And then you might want to ask the child, hey, you want to try it on your own? Do you think you can do it? And this is really important because I know that I myself, when I was a very young teacher, I might give a handwriting practice page to my students and just walk away thinking, the lines are there, the numbers are there, they should be able to do it by themselves. But actually, sometimes what happens is children, and this happens with Chinese, I think, and Japanese, where they will write the same stroke down the page
Yeah.
over and over again. Then the next stroke, the second stroke, down the page over and over again. And
Stroke
so,
by stroke, not
yeah,
character. Oh, wow.
yeah, not, instead
Okay.
of character by character, sometimes with Asian scripts, children to be really quick, they will do a stroke by stroke. But the
Oh, wow.
drawback of that is they're not actually internalizing the shape of the kanji or the character and
Yeah.
how the units fit together. They are just piecing together random strokes. So that's not as helpful
Mm.
as if we later on, I'll touch on it. That's not as helpful as looking at the internal components of each character.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah.
Ah,
And then the second answer related
yeah.
to how do we spell accurately is connect spelling instruction with writing as much as possible. And as children are growing and learning as writers, of course, we understand as adults, parents, and teachers that children are not going to spell perfectly in any language, right? So one
Yeah.
thing that we recommend as educators, practitioners, and researchers is to allow for errors, but sort of controlled errors. So we want children to make educated guesses based on what we've taught them and based on what they've practiced. So we want to stay away from the extremes of expecting perfection from our
Yeah.
early spellers And we also want to stay away from the extreme of a free-for-all, like, however you want to spell it works, because that will not teach them to be able to communicate with an audience who might have trouble deciphering uh,
Yeah.
their unconventional way of spelling. And
Yeah.
so the strategies that are recommended are invented spelling for young children in kindergarten and grade 1. That's about ages 4 to 6, sometimes 7, where you spell the way that you know how as best as possible using all of the letter names and sounds you've already been exposed to. Then as you get
Okay.
older, we spell by analogy. So if we know how to spell one word, we can use that word to spell another word. So for example, if I know can, like I can hop, I can, then maybe I know man. So I can use can to spell man. And spelling by analogy is really helpful for older children. Just the ability to take patterns of one word and applying it to another word.
Okay.
Yeah,
Uh-huh. I think
helps.
that answers actually the question I wanted to ask you about correction.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so it's better to like help them a bit, or maybe to when they're writing, for example, a letter to their grandparents or something, if they write something that we can understand, we leave it. But if we can't understand what the word is, then we need to intervene. Is that correct?
Uh, yes. That strategy is helpful because it tells the child, hey, when we write, it's not just writing my ideas, it's writing my ideas so mom and dad can understand. Um,
Yeah.
and I would add on that it's helpful to nudge them to apply what you've taught them. So if this week you've worked on the at sound, then every time your child is writing a word with the at sound, we would expect that they would use the letter A to represent at. We wouldn't
Okay. Yeah.
we
Yeah.
wouldn't
Yeah.
sort of give too much leeway to allow for, like a random letter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I understand. Yeah.
Mm,
Uh, and sorry, I'm just looking through my questions.
mm.
Okay. Yeah, in Chinese, for example, in Japanese, is that the same thing for the strokes? So because if you have a stroke that's different, it might change the character. Or do we need to be more precise for Chinese or Japanese, or is it the same idea? If we can understand, can we understand if it's not correct? Okay, I still ask my question, but I'm thinking maybe in Japanese or Chinese, if we get the strokes wrong, we can't understand. So maybe we have to be more precise. Is that correct?
I would say I agree with that because certain languages are quite visual
Yeah.
and it may not be, I mean, later we'll talk about it, but it may not have as many sound components as, say, an alphabetic language like Spanish and English and French. So you can see that in the pedagogy. So in, China or Japan or different parts of the world that use logographic scripts, they might be more precise with how they want children to write. They may not allow for as many mistakes. But your question about would we be confused if there are missing strokes? I think as adults, as a teacher, sometimes I use the context of the sentence to guess what the word might be.
Yeah.
Um, but but I would I think I would find myself using your strategy, which is to correct if there is a stroke order and
Okay.
stroke writing mistake.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm,
And so now I would like to talk about more the Latin alphabet.
sure.
So there are some languages that have deep orthography. So for example,
Mm,
English, where there are different ways to write a sound, uh, or one combination of letters can be read in different ways. And other languages like Spanish, which are very transparent.
mm,
Um, would you, so regarding mistakes, would you have the same advice for both kind of languages? Or if it's a transparent language, maybe you need to be more precise with like getting your child to write all the letters properly on the right order?
That's a great question. So your observation is getting at the fundamental principle for multilingual learners and literacy, which is that we must teach the language the way that it works. So this one is tricky to explain, just by talking. So I will show you some
Yeah.
slides that hopefully can help us visualize this. Okay, let's start with English because that might be the language that the viewers and you and I share in common. So English is language that uses both phonics, attaching sounds and letters together, and morphology.
Yeah.
So because of its influence from other languages, Latin, French, etc., English is not always spelled the way that it sounds. And a lot of the time it has to do with preservation of meaning because it came from a different language.
Yeah.
So when we teach English, we will see that children usually spend like maybe 4 years, kindergarten through third grade, learning phonics, attaching sounds with spelling patterns. Then as children get older, they start learning the different combinations of letters that not only give sound, but also preserve and convey meaning.
Okay.
So to touch on English a little bit more, very early children learning how to spell accurately will first have to practice phonological awareness, and that is the ability and awareness to hear sounds. So
Mm.
in this example, sheep, a very young child will practice hearing sh, e, sheep, right? And so they are not expected perhaps to spell everything accurately, but it would be very helpful later on for spelling if young children can begin to hear those sound parts within words. Then, as children get older, we can use something called Elkanon boxes in order to have children practice not only hearing the sounds in words, but matching those sounds with letters. So in this example, sh would be matched with sh,
Yeah.
E would be matched with the long vowel pattern EE, and then P would be matched with the letter P. And children will practice putting these sound patterns together, knowing that sometimes spelling patterns look different than what they sound like. So a very young child might see the letter E and think, oh, I think that's like elephant, right? But as we get older, we know, oh, but if we put two E's together, some of the times that makes the sound E, like in sh, E.
Yeah.
And then finally, as children get even older, grades 2 to 6, we're talking about morphology. So that is understanding that parts within words have meaning, whether it's from a different language, like Latin and French, as we talked about earlier, or whether it's a grammatical element that also conveys meaning. So in this example, the sheep leaped. And we can say that morphologically, the ed at the end is past tense. The meaning of it is that it already happened. And so when we teach this to young children, they know, oh, even though we hear t, leaped, I don't want to use the letter T. I want to use the morphology. I want to use ED because I'm signaling to my reader, this already happened. I'm using the unit of ED to convey a meaning. And so for English spelling, this is the progression of how we would teach children to build their spelling skills from sound to mapping sound and print. Some people call it orthographic mapping, and then finally to attention to morphology.
Okay.
But then, say we have Spanish. As you were saying, Spanish is a very transparent language, and what that means is that usually one letter matches with one sound, or two letters matches with the same sound over and over again. And
Yeah.
because Spanish is so transparent, we will see that young children actually spend a far shorter time in phonics compared to a deeper language. And so when children are learning Spanish, typically phonics instruction is kindergarten through first grade, and then that's it. But
Yeah.
it's a mistake to think that, oh, Spanish is so easy, because actually, although orthographically it might be transparent, it's a very, very rich morphological language. And so even, like mano, that comes from the Latin of, which is feminine. So,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
general
Yeah.
Spanish rules, we would think mano is masculine because it ends in an O. But if we
Yeah.
understand morphology and word parts and origins, we know, when we talk about hand, we're talking about something feminine. So it would be la mano, right? So this is something that children still have to learn, although they can encode quite easily in a transparent language like Spanish. And so for Spanish, when we're teaching spelling, because it's so transparent, the Elkanon boxes are not as necessary, but they're helpful. And the way that teachers teach Spanish efficiently is through syllables. Because
Ah,
compared to English, Spanish is, although it's similarly alphabetic, it has a much more well-defined what they call syllabic structure. So instead of stretching out the whole word like oveja. To be more efficient, you want to chunk the sounds into syllables. So be oveja, oveja. And this is a way that children can spell efficiently rather than little by little. They can actually spell part by part, syllable by syllable. And then very quickly for Chinese spelling, this is very interesting because it's a very nice contrast to Spanish, which is transparent, and English, which is pretty opaque.
Yeah.
Chinese, as we all know, is even more opaque because it is such a visual language.
Yeah.
So when young children are learning to spell, they have to be able to hear sounds and language, but also they have to be able to see visual units. So what that means is they have to be able to see, this stroke looks different from this stroke. And it's much more important, I think, than say in an alphabetic language where if I'm writing an alphabetic letter, my letter might be a little crooked, but it still represents that letter.
Yeah.
But in Chinese, if my strokes are very unconventional, as you were talking about earlier, it might be quite difficult to decipher. So the visual awareness is very important for early Chinese readers. And unlike alphabetic languages like Spanish and English, Chinese really relies on morphology,
Okay.
which again is meaningful units. And I wanted to show you that the word sheep in kanji or Chinese
Yeah.
looks like this. It's an ideogram. It looks like the word it represents. So yang in Chinese has the two horns because it looks like a sheep with the sheep's two horns. So children have to be able to see this visually and remember it as yang. But one thing that non-Chinese speakers often may not understand is that not all Chinese characters are ideograms or ideographs. In fact, 80% are what we call compound characters, which means that they have two main parts. On one side, you might have something called the semantic radical, which gives you meaning cues. And on the other side, you might have something called a phonetic radical, which gives a sound clue. And so in this case, we have yang or sheep on one side. But if you look on the other side, there's a word for ocean. And you'll see that the left side, the three dots, it means water. And it's connected with the word ocean because oceans have water. Then on the right side, it also has the word sheep because yang sounds like sheep and ocean. And so this character has the word sheep to signal that you should pronounce it
Yeah.
yang, just like the sheep. So for children learning Chinese, yes, the visual cues are very, very important, but later on, by about age 8 or so, third grade or so, they start to really break down the components of characters and pay attention to phonetic radicals to give them clues into how do I pronounce this character. Now, it doesn't always work because Chinese is so opaque, but it does give clues. It gives some
Yeah.
hints of what the character might sound like.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm glad you had examples with different languages. And I would like to, I see that there are a few people following us live. If you have your own questions about your languages, so maybe if Dr. Chang Ng is not very familiar with it, might be difficult, but I guess we can have equivalents. So feel free to ask your questions. And so I have another question. So more about multilingual children. So, for example, when they are multilingual, when they are learning to read and write in different languages, we can use their knowledge of what writing is, or so what the signs on the paper represent. So they represent sounds, ideas, etc. Um, and so we can transfer that to another language that they are learning. Uh, so how can we use the different languages our children know to their advantage and to help them like master the writing in different languages? Do you have any tips on this?
Yes, absolutely. So this one, I have a couple slides, but because our topic is science of writing, I didn't want to get too deep into it, but I
Okay, yeah,
will potentially like make another maybe presentation about this, about how do we
Okay.
leverage one language to access and acquire another language. That is a very, very good point and something that all educators and parents should be aware of. Because in the past, we all know that the myth was, oh, this will confuse children. But now researchers and practitioners are seeing in the classroom and in their studies that actually, no, if we use the comparison of languages strategically, this can actually accelerate biliteracy without confusing children. So
Mm.
let me just show you really quickly what that might look like.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. Oh, oops. Oh, hold on. Ah, Estrellita is a Spanish curriculum. I
Okay.
accidentally clicked it. Oops. Okay, so I want to start off the answer to this part with a quote. So a group of researchers got together recently last year. They issued a joint statement, these literacy experts saying, a student's home language is an asset that should be valued and nurtured because of its intrinsic value and because it can be used to leverage second language acquisition and second language literacy development, which is,
Yeah.
Yoshito, exactly what you were talking about. So we want parents and teachers to understand that in early biliteracy, we want to think of English as perhaps one side of a bridge and the target language as the other side. And if we build bridges, metaphorically
Yeah.
with children, they can conceivably develop both quite well. One way teachers do so in immersion schools, Spanish immersion, Mandarin Chinese immersion, is I'll name two big strategies. One is translanguaging, and that is when the teacher will move intentionally and fluidly between languages in the classroom to encourage children to use their full linguistic repertoire. And
Yeah.
Dr. Taylor, who will be on your event tomorrow, she also has a really great reel about this. And she mentions parents can also translanguage at home. Perhaps there's a new vocabulary word, as Dr. Taylor mentions in her reel, and you want your child to understand this vocabulary word in two languages. You can switch out of the language you're speaking in into the other language and create a bridge. This is very effective because it's efficient. Rather than waiting for your child to guess that, these two words are equivalent in meaning, you can just directly tell them, right?
Yeah.
And then the
That's
second
true.
strategy is making cross-linguistic connections. So this is building bridges between languages and analyzing what's similar and what's different. And you can do both of these strategies with any combination of languages. However, these strategies tend to work more quickly if there's a very short linguistic distance between the two
Yeah.
languages. Like Spanish and Italian, wow, you could do so many bridges between the two languages and then the
Yeah.
connections are very fast. But say you have, Japanese and English, the linguistic distance is much farther. So
Mhm.
something in one language may not translate into another. And that difference is what should be explored with children. So rather than have children puzzle over how come I can say this in Japanese but not in English, we can directly teach them, hey, the syntax for Japanese is this order, but look at English, what do you think the syntax is here? And so you can directly teach word order syntax by using side-by-side comparisons that help children not ignore differences, but rather to examine them and
Yeah.
explore them and play with them. Um,
Yeah.
and then I think, oh, okay, yes. And then so that is my quick answer, but there's so much more to this question.
Yeah, and I observed as well, like with my sons. So I'm just to talk about uh, like pointing our children to like the similarities or the distance between the languages, but what's similar or not, and to create these bridges. I've seen with my sons that, for example, when they were little, it was very difficult for them to translate from one language to another. So
Mm.
when we were in Korea, and like I was just with them and we are asking something to a shopkeeper and I asked them what the shopkeeper said. It was difficult for them to explain to me, and when I wanted to say something, it was difficult for them to translate. And
Mm.
it's the same for words. Sometimes, for example, my son is now learning Spanish, and but Spanish is there are quite a lot of things that are similar to French. So I tried to guide him and to say, did you see that this was similar in French and in Spanish? And then he realizes, ah, yeah. but on his own, he wouldn't do it. So I think, yeah, it's something we need to train them to do or to point at it several times and then they start doing it on their own. But yeah, so I like what you said about being explicit about this, building these bridges.
Absolutely, because what you're observing as a parent is very astute. There's a study out of, I think, Canada by a researcher called Bell and her team, and she found the same thing that French English bilingual children in Canada do not automatically make these cross-linguistic connections. But that when they were able to be more accurate in the language that they were learning. So being able to see that the syntax in French and English are sometimes different, that was very helpful to be pointed out by the teacher. So you're absolutely right. Young children do not always see these differences, although it might look like, they're absorbing how language works and maybe they sound conventional in their word order, but they may not understand it. They may not be able to explain it. And so having a teacher or parent explicitly instruct on this, on grammar, is very helpful. Because we always want children to be able to teach something, right? The better you can teach something, it signals that you've actually learned it, right? But if you
Yeah,
could do it without really thinking about it, I'm it's more questionable whether you have a true mastery of it.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And so I see we're nearly at an hour. But
Ah,
so if people want to ask questions, don't hesitate. I'm just going to ask quickly because we're talking about grammar. If
mm.
what's your view on it? Should it be taught explicitly, implicitly, a mix of both?
Great question. So, it depends. And for me, I would say with my population of students, and if I were to have my own children and raise them multilingual one day, I would say a mix. And I would, more than anything, make sure that I'm teaching grammar in context. So I have a very quick 3 slides to show everyone what that might look like. So say I am teaching a child English. And that language is not a heritage language. I might explicitly teach the language feature past continuous tense in this example and explain why it's important. It's helpful to describe the scene. Then I would show them in writing what that might look like. So in this case, there's a unicorn who was feeling adventurous. And to describe the scene, the sun was shining. So we can use this grammar tense to set the scene as writers. Then
Uh,
it's very important to have an applied part. So not just the teacher or parent talking, but like a back and forth dialogic seesaw, a learning experience between the student and the teacher. So you want the child to apply what they've just heard and seen you model. So for example, you might say, okay, if we have the sentence rainbow dash blank, she could learn how to swim. How can we change that into past continuous tense? And then you would hope that they would use what we've explicitly taught and say Rainbow Dash was hoping she could learn how to swim.
yeah.
And so this applied practice is something that as a young teacher, I often forgot about or I didn't know about perhaps. And I would often wonder to myself, how come I taught it, but my students don't seem to apply it in their writing? And as I became more seasoned as a teacher, I realized one of the missing pieces was the active engagement applied practice component of teaching grammar in context.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess at home, it doesn't need to be on paper all the time. It can just be in a conversation and just repeating like or modeling how it should be said so that the children can repeat and get used to using this new grammar rule that they've seen. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, absolutely.
We have a question from Danielle or
Okay.
Daniels. I'm really sorry if I mispronounce your name. So she says, I teach multilinguals that are taught to write on print letters, but I observe that they don't find difficult to read cursive writing. Just to come back on the cursive and print letters. So they learn to write in print, but they don't learn to write in cursive, but they're able to read it.
Oh, so is the question, why is that possible?
Um, I guess it's more an observation. Maybe it's because we're talking about it. So I guess it's to reinforce and to give an example to say that it happens with her students as well.
Oh, yes, I remember you were saying that there was no confusion with your son, with your children, that they,
Yeah,
after a few repetitions with cursive, they were able to not mix up both. So I think
yeah,
maybe Danielle's comment is to echo, like, yes, you could conceivably teach two scripts and not cause confusion.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And yeah, I guess once they know, because there are some letters that are very similar, whether it's in
Mm.
cursive or in print. So if you get used to these, then also I guess the knowledge of the language, you can make up the letters that you don't know, you don't recognize. Then you get used to it the more you read.
Ah, absolutely. So, reading and writing are two sides of the same coin. The more we read, the better we write. The more we write, the better we read.
Yeah,
And actually, I know our time is up, but I can't resist
that's
sharing this
fine. Yeah,
quote with you. Okay, let me see. Okay. Pam Allen writes, reading is like breathing in, writing is like breathing out, and storytelling is what links both. It is the soul of literacy. So I wanted to share this because, Yoshida, you're a children's book author and an author that helps so many parents around the world. And I feel that you are an amazing storyteller. And I want us to remember that when we teach our children reading and writing, that it's not the mechanics of the language, rather it's the child's identity and the child's ability to storytell and feel seen in the world. And I think that is
yeah,
why reading and writing is something that we can gift our children, not because we want to teach them rules, but because we want them to express themselves and feel that they have a contribution and a voice in this world that so often is made for adults.
yeah. Thank you very much. That's
Mhm.
a very nice quote and explanation. And just because we're talking about loads of things to do with spelling, etc., I just wanted to let everyone know that after the event, so I pre-recorded an interview with a speech and language therapist who was French. So we did the interview in French, but I'm putting all the subtitles in English. It should be out on Monday, so I'm trying to do it as fast as I can. But so yeah, if you're interested as well from a speech and language therapist point of view, what she thinks about writing, spelling, especially of languages with deep orthography, you can watch this interview as well. And so we are coming to the end of the hour. Is there one thing you would like to parents to remember, so to keep in mind when they're teaching their children to write? I know that you might have loads of things, but if you had to pick one key thing that people maybe often forget, or yeah,
This one, I think educators out there already know. And if I say it, they'll be like, I already knew that. But I think it's important to reiterate. So oral language is the foundation of literacy for most typically developing children. So I would say that don't forget that rich conversations with your child will be very important for helping your child love the written word and helping your child love going into different worlds through different books as a reader.
yeah.
So make sure to have conversations with your child so that they develop rich oral language. And then that vocabulary and that curiosity for the world are very important assets as they develop as readers and writers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
And
Yoshito.
thank you very much for again participating in this event. I think it was really informative, and especially for parents who have young children and they're very hesitant about what they can do, what they should do, or they shouldn't do. It was quite enlightening. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Yoshito. I can't wait to watch all the other speakers for your event. It's been a blast this evening, and I know that you've worked so hard behind the scenes, and I want to thank you for your organization.
Thank you very much. And so we meet back at 2 o'clock. So I'm going to do a session to explain how we can teach our children to read and write. So as parents, how we can do it. Yesterday, we've heard from three speakers that it was very difficult. But so I did it, I guess, more or less successfully with my sons. Not always, it wasn't always like really easy, but I'm going to share with you a few tips that might help you as well on the on your children's multiliteracy journey. So thank you very much again. and see you everyone at 2 o'clock UK time.
Thank you,
Bye.
Yoshi. See you later. Bye bye.
Bye.